This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about the most sophisticated form of execution freeze I have ever encountered, in myself, in the people I have worked with, and in the research that finally gave me the language to understand what was actually happening underneath it. Not procrastination, not fear of failure in the conventional sense, not the analysis paralysis or the completion anxiety we have discussed before on this channel, though what I am about to describe lives in the same psychological neighborhood as both of them and frequently travels with one or both of them at the same time. What I am talking about is the specific, paralyzing, output-destroying experience of imposter syndrome, not as a confidence problem, which is how it is almost always discussed, but as an execution problem, a production problem, a specific mechanism by which the fear of being seen, evaluated, and found ordinary stops capable people from producing anything at all. Because here is what most conversations about imposter syndrome miss entirely. The damage is not primarily psychological, it is behavioral. It is the work that does not get made, the output that does not get produced, the capability that exists fully formed inside a person who has been frozen at the execution stage, not by lack of skill, not by lack of drive, not by any of the conventional execution barriers, but by a very specific and very rational fear that finishing the work will make the fraud testable, that as long as nothing is produced, as long as the work remains unfinished, unsubmitted, unseen, the fear of being exposed as ordinary cannot be confirmed. The protection of the unfinished state is intact, and the imposter, whoever they secretly believe they are, remains safely undetected. Today we name that mechanism precisely, and today we build the exit. I want to tell you about a version of myself that I find genuinely difficult to describe without some discomfort. In the period following my business collapse, when I was rebuilding and had begun slowly and tentatively to develop a reputation in a new professional direction, I encountered a specific and unfamiliar form of paralysis that I had not experienced before in the same way. Before the collapse, I had been, externally at least, someone with visible credentials, a track record, a business with clients and staff, and the kind of tangible evidence of capability that external credibility rests on. I had not questioned whether I belonged in the rooms I was in. The evidence said I did. After the collapse, that evidence was gone. And what replaced it, quietly, insidiously, without announcing itself clearly enough to be examined, was a suspicion. A private, persistent, occasionally overwhelming suspicion that the capability people had seen in me before had been partially a function of the structure that surrounded it. That without the business, the title, the external scaffold, what remained might not be enough, might not be what people thought it was, might not be what I had thought it was. And here is what that suspicion did to my output. It stopped it. Not dramatically, not in a single moment of obvious freeze, gradually, specifically. At the precise point in every execution attempt where producing something meant submitting something to assessment. I would write to 90% and stop. Develop to near completion and pause. Begin with genuine energy and momentum, and then, at the exact point where finishing would make the work real and accessible and mine in a way that could be evaluated, find an urgent reason why a little more preparation was needed before the final step. I was not avoiding the work. I was avoiding the verdict the finished work would produce. Because the verdict would say something about whether the person producing the work was genuinely capable, or whether what everyone had seen before had been a more favorable set of circumstances wearing the costume of personal capability. The imposter fear was not damaging my confidence, it was halting my output, directly, structurally, with a precision that I only understood years later when I found the research that mapped it exactly. The psychological and neurological architecture of imposter syndrome as an execution freeze, specifically the mechanism by which it halts production rather than merely undermining confidence, is documented across several bodies of research that together paint a picture more specific and more actionable than most discussions of this topic ever reach. The first foundational piece comes from the original research of Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes at Georgia State University, the clinical psychologists who identified and named the imposter phenomenon in their landmark 1978 paper. Clance and Imes were studying high-achieving women in academic and professional settings and found a consistent pattern that they had not anticipated. Despite external evidence of significant achievement, advanced degrees, professional recognition, demonstrable track records of success, a substantial proportion of the high-achieving people they studied privately believed that their success was not fully deserved, that it was the result of luck, timing, the low standards of others, or a successful performance of competence that would eventually be seen through, and that at some point, At the moment of genuine testing, of real exposure, the truth would emerge and the fraud would be confirmed. What Clance and Iams documented was not low self-esteem in the conventional sense. Many of the people in their research had confident external presentations. What they had identified was something more specific, a persistent dissociation between external evidence of capability and internal felt sense of it. A gap between what the achievement said about the person and what the person privately believed about themselves. But the finding that most subsequent discussions of their work miss is this. Clance and Iams found that the primary behavioral response to the imposter fear was not reduced performance on existing tasks. It was avoidance of new exposure. The specific behavioral tendency to not produce work that would create new opportunities for the fraud to be tested. This is the execution mechanism the rest of this conversation is built on. The imposter fear does not primarily make you perform badly. It makes you produce less, because production is the act that creates the test, and the test is what the fear is protecting you from. The second body of research comes from Dr. Valerie Young at the Imposter Syndrome Institute, whose work categorizing the different types of imposter syndrome experience produced a taxonomy that maps directly onto different patterns of execution freeze. Young identified 5 distinct imposter types, each defined by the specific standard against which they measure themselves and find themselves secretly lacking. The perfectionist, whose imposter fear activates around the gap between what they produced and what they believe they should have been capable of producing. The execution freeze for this type manifests as the inability to declare work finished, because finishing requires accepting the imperfect version that actually exists rather than the perfect version that should have been possible. The expert, whose imposter fear centers on the belief that genuine experts know more than they currently know. The execution freeze for this type manifests as the compulsion to acquire more knowledge before producing, because producing without complete knowledge risks exposing the gap between their actual expertise and the expertise they believe they should have. The natural genius, whose imposter fear activates when effort is required. They believe genuine capability should produce results effortlessly. The execution freeze for this type manifests as the abandonment of work that requires sustained effort, because needing to work hard at something feels like evidence that they are not genuinely talented at it. The soloist, whose imposter fear centers on independence. They believe genuine capability means not needing help. The execution freeze for this type manifests as the refusal to collaborate, ask questions, or seek support, because needing any of those things feels like evidence of inadequacy. And the superhero, whose imposter fear activates around role performance. They believe genuine capability means excelling in every role simultaneously. The execution freeze for this type manifests as the paralysis that comes from not being able to do everything perfectly, which makes doing anything feel insufficient. Young's taxonomy is practically important because it reveals that the execution freeze takes a different specific form depending on which imposter type is dominant, and the intervention needs to be matched to the specific type rather than applied generically. The third explanation draws from the research of Dr. Carol Dweck, whose work on identity and mindset I have covered extensively on this channel, applied to the imposter syndrome mechanism with a specific angle I want to address directly. Dweck's research on the fixed mindset identified the belief that capability is fixed and revelatory, that performance reveals a permanent truth about the level of intelligence or talent a person possesses, as the foundational cognitive structure that makes failure feel existentially threatening rather than informationally useful. Imposter syndrome is the fixed mindset operating in reverse, not the fear that failure will reveal insufficient capability, but the fear that success, or the absence of obvious failure so far, has created a false impression of capability that genuine testing will eventually correct. The fixed mindset says, if I fail, it will prove I was never as capable as people thought. Imposter syndrome says, if I produce work that gets evaluated, it will prove I was never as capable as people thought. Both reach the same behavioral conclusion. Don't produce, don't submit, don't create the test that might produce the confirming verdict. And Dweck's research on the growth mindset provides the precise cognitive reframe that addresses both, the replacement of the fixed capability belief with the belief that capability is developed through production, feedback, and iteration. That what gets tested in the evaluation of finished work is not the permanent ceiling of a person's intelligence, but the current state of their developing skill. And that the current state is neither a verdict nor a destination. It is a data point in an ongoing development trajectory. The fourth mechanism comes from the research of Dr. Brené Brown at the University of Houston, whose decades of work on shame and vulnerability documented the specific relationship between shame and the withholding of creative and professional output. Brown found in her research that shame, the intensely painful belief that we are fundamentally flawed and therefore unworthy of belonging and connection, is the primary driver of what she calls creative self-protection, the tendency to withhold authentic work, to produce carefully managed versions of our real output that are sufficiently guarded to prevent the exposure of what we fear is genuinely insufficient underneath. Brown's research showed that the imposter fear is fundamentally a shame-based phenomenon. The fear of being exposed as ordinary or fraudulent is not primarily a cognitive fear. It is a shame fear, the fear that the exposure will result in the loss of the belonging, the respect and the connection that the person believes their perceived capability is currently sustaining. And Brown found something about shame that is directly relevant to the execution freeze. Shame thrives in secrecy and silence. It loses power in the light of authentic expression and connection. The withholding of output that shame drives is the very mechanism that keeps the shame active, because it prevents the authentic expression that would disconfirm the belief driving it. The person who never produces the work never discovers that the work is good enough, never receives the response that updates the imposter belief, never accumulates the evidence that the fear was protecting against a verdict that was never coming. The execution freeze is the shame's primary survival mechanism, and the exit from the freeze is the thing the shame most wants to prevent. Here is the practical framework, built directly on the research and matched to the specific mechanism of the imposter-driven execution freeze. The first intervention addresses Clance and Iams's foundational finding, the dissociation between external evidence of capability and internal felt sense of it. It is a deliberate evidence audit, a structured examination of the external record that the imposter fear has been systematically discounting. Write down every significant piece of external evidence of your capability in the relevant domain. Not your assessment of that evidence, the evidence itself, the things you have produced, the results you have generated, the responses you have received from people whose judgment you respect. Then write, for each piece of evidence, the specific discount the imposter voice has applied to it. The luck attribution, the low standards attribution, the favorable circumstances attribution, the it was a different version of me attribution. You are not trying to prove the imposter voice wrong in this exercise. You are making its discounting mechanism visible, because Clance and Iams's research shows that the imposter fear does not respond to the existence of contrary evidence. It responds to evidence that has not been discounted. And the discounting happens automatically, invisibly, without examination, until the examination is forced. Look at the evidence without the discount applied. That is what the external world has actually seen. That is the capability that has actually been demonstrated. The imposter voice's interpretation of it is not the only interpretation available. The second intervention addresses Young's imposter type taxonomy, and it requires identifying your dominant type before applying the specific intervention designed for it. For the perfectionist type, the intervention is a predefined, done standard, written before the work begins. One sentence that specifies what finished means at its most minimal, honest level. Not perfect, done. The work that exists in the world rather than the work that exists in the imagination is what should have been possible. The perfectionist's freeze is broken not by lowering standards, but by separating the act of completing from the act of excelling. Completing is non-negotiable. Excelling is the ongoing aspiration. They are not the same deadline. For the expert type, the intervention is a knowledge threshold, written before any additional research begins. The specific, pre-committed level of knowledge that constitutes enough to produce, not complete knowledge, sufficient knowledge, and the specific date at which production begins regardless of whether additional knowledge has been acquired. The expert's freeze is broken by the recognition that no production threshold is ever met by waiting, only by producing and discovering what the production reveals about what remains to learn. For the natural genius type, the intervention is an effort reframe, written before any effortful work session. One sentence that separates effort from inadequacy. Effort is not evidence that I lack the capability for this. Effort is the process through which capability is expressed in domains that matter enough to be worth doing carefully. The genius type's freeze is broken by replacing the belief that ease equals capability with the evidence, documented in Dweck's research, that the most genuine capability is built and expressed through sustained, effortful engagement rather than effortless performance. For the soloist type, the intervention is a single, specific, bounded request for input, not a wholesale opening of the work to others. One question, one person, one piece of external perspective that is sought deliberately and whose acquisition is predefined as an act of intelligent collaboration rather than evidence of inadequacy. And for the superhero type, the intervention is a role hierarchy. One sentence written before the working day begins that names the single most important role for today and grants explicit permission to perform the others at a lower standard. Not every role can be superhuman simultaneously. The hierarchy makes the choice conscious rather than leaving the freeze to make it by default. The third intervention addresses Brown's shame and vulnerability research, and it is the most structurally important of the framework because it operates at the level where the imposter freeze is most deeply rooted. It is a deliberate, bounded act of authentic production exposure, sharing unfinished, imperfect, genuinely representative work with one person whose response you trust before the work is complete enough to feel fully safe. Not a public release, not a vulnerable oversharing. One person, one piece of work that represents where you actually are, not where you want to appear to be. One experience of genuine production exposure that is not catastrophically responded to. Brown's research is explicit. Shame is metabolized through witnessed vulnerability. The imposter fear is updated through the direct experience of producing authentic work and discovering that the response does not confirm the feared verdict. One experience of this, however small, however bounded, begins to update the shame system in a way that no amount of cognitive reframing can replicate. The exposure is the medicine, and it must be genuine, the work that actually represents your current output, not the carefully managed version designed to prevent the imposter from showing. The fourth intervention addresses Dweck's fixed capability belief directly. It is a production reframe, a specific cognitive replacement that repositions every piece of finished work from a capability verdict to a development data point. Before submitting, releasing, or sharing any piece of work, write this sentence. This work represents where my skill is today. It is not a permanent ceiling. It is a current position in an ongoing development trajectory. The response it receives is information about the next iteration, not a verdict on the fixed level of what I am capable of. This reframe does not make the response less important. It changes what the response means. From a confirmation or disconfirmation of permanent capability, which is what makes the verdict feel existentially threatening, to a data point in a development process that continues regardless of this particular outcome. Dweck's research showed that this reframe, when it is genuinely internalized rather than intellectually acknowledged, reduces the psychological cost of production exposure enough to make finishing and submitting feel survivable rather than catastrophic. Not comfortable, survivable. And survivable is all the nervous system needs to allow the action to proceed. I want to close with something honest about the imposter fear that I think needs to be said directly. The fear of being exposed as ordinary is not irrational. For many high-functioning people, it is the entirely understandable response to having built a significant portion of their professional identity on a standard of performance that they privately believe is fragile. That could be contradicted by a single piece of work that does not meet it. The imposter fear is the identity's immune system, trying to protect the self-concept from the evidence that might threaten it. But here is what the immune system does not understand. The evidence it is protecting you from is the only evidence that can actually update the imposter belief. The verdict you are preventing is the only verdict that can replace the internal verdict you are already living with. The person who finishes the work and submits it, who produces the output that makes the imposter fear testable, discovers one of two things. Either the work is received in a way that disconfirms the imposter belief and provides genuine external evidence that the capability is real, or the work reveals a genuine developmental gap that can be specifically addressed, specifically improved, and specifically closed through the iteration that only produced work makes possible. Both outcomes are better than the outcome the freeze produces. The freeze produces nothing, no evidence, no update, no development, no movement in any direction. Just the imposter belief, running uncontested in the silence that the unfinished work creates, growing stronger with every piece of output it successfully prevents. Finish the work. Submit it. Let the response say what it says. You are not protecting your capability by not producing. You are protecting the imposter fear's ability to keep telling you a story that only finished work can prove or disprove. Produce the work. Find out what is actually true. I suspect it is not what the fear has been telling you. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.